Good afternoon. It is Friday, July 28th, 2023. Now, one of the most commonly asked questions throughout the endeavor of human history has been about suffering. Why do good people suffer? It seems like so often the good people suffer and the bad people get away with terrible things. Jesus encountered a lot of suffering people. Many of the suffering sought out Jesus. Some of them he sought out to relieve their suffering himself. The woman in today's passage had suffered for years, both physically and financially. In Mark chapter 5, verses 24 to 29, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation, second edition, it says, Jesus went with him and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she'd spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she'd gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. This is an amazing story. Jesus is on the way to Jairus' house to see about his sick daughter, and this woman comes up. The scripture says has had constant bleeding, not occasional bleeding, not monthly bleeding, but constant bleeding for 12 years. And she had some means, so she went to a lot of doctors. And the scripture says she suffered from doctors. They all wanted to examine her physically, and they wanted to give her painful and ineffective treatments. She had the suffering from the bleeding, but then she also had the suffering from the doctors. And she paid through the nose. And they didn't work. Nothing helped. In fact, she kept getting worse. Her suffering was not alleviated. Her suffering was increased. And then she heard about Jesus. She heard about his healing, his strengthening, his cleansing, his giving sight to the blind. And she thought, he could heal me. And she thought, I don't need to get in front of him. I don't need to be a public spectacle. I just want to touch the hem of his garment. I just want to touch his robe. And so she comes up behind him and she reaches out through the crowd and she grabs a hold of his robe. And immediately, she feels the healing in her body. The pain stopped, the bleeding stopped, and she felt an immediate healing. You know, her suffering would not have been apparent at first glance. You might see her every day and never recognize how much she was suffering. But Jesus knew. We are surrounded by suffering people, some physically, some financially, some spiritually, some emotionally, some in their families. And we always need to have the kind of compassion that recognizes that sometimes that person that we're struggling with, they're suffering, probably suffering more than we are. And sometimes the most difficult people are the ones that are suffering the most. Sometimes not. Sometimes they're just jerks. But it is important for us to have the compassion of Jesus to try and give relief to the suffering, to try and help them every chance we get. This week, may you find relief from your suffering, and may you help someone else who's suffering and struggling. And may God use you to bring relief to those who hurt. God bless you.